Yes, now my people, welcome back to another episode of the Physique Podcast. We are back again with another solo episode. And today I'm going to be talking about a situation, a moment in my life that has affected me deeply and has shaped the man that I am today. And that is the passing of my dad in 2023. Now, I just want to give a little bit of context to that year as a whole. So at the time, I was living in Sheffield with my girlfriend. We had a 4-bedroom house. I was smashing it, making a lot of money coaching, 15, 20 grand months. Life was amazing. And then my dad went into hospital May of 2023. And he never got out. He died in November 2023. Do you know what? I couldn't even give you a date. It was that whole part of my life was just a blur. I remember being in prep. All whilst this was happening, I was competing. We'd been told multiple times that he was going to pass away. He had 2 weeks to live. And then his situation improved to a point where we thought he was coming home. We thought he would leave the hospital for the first time since May. And I think that's what killed me the most, is that I was living at Joe Jeffrey's house at the time, and I can't thank them enough for being there with me throughout that process. You know, it was very emotional and very up and down. And we remember having the time where the hospital bed was brought into the living room. So we actually got rid of the dining table and we had a hospital bed in there because we thought he was going to come home. And then 3 weeks later, he's dead. And you go through that process and you're like, fuck. Wow, what's really happened here? You go from one extreme to the other so quickly in such a short period of time. And you know, the person that isn't even important in this situation is me. You know, I've handled it, in my opinion, better than my entire family from the face of it. I was the person that organised the funeral, had the conversation with the coroner, and the main thing for me was when my mum moved in. She didn't move in. When my mum walked into my bedroom and said to me my dad passed away, I'd literally not even wiped the sleep off my eyes. And I was like, right, well, let's do it. So I was debating whether or not I would go into the room. I was stood outside the hospital door, and I was like, fuck, I gotta do this. I simply have to just be in that room and make peace with the situation, because the reality is, out of everyone in my family, my dad was the only person that really remotely understood what I was doing. He was the only one that really gave a fuck about my bodybuilding. He's the only one that really took time to understand my coaching career. And, throughout my entire life, he was the one person that helped me whenever I had issues. So I don't really ask for help. However, whenever I had an issue, whenever I had a situation that needed solving, I had a problem that needed solving, he would always be the guy that I would call. He would always be the person that stepped up. Let me give you an example. When I was out of a job in 2020, I'm sure, as everyone knows, that COVID happened March 2020. And I had to borrow money to pay rent. Who did I call? My dad. There's no one else. And for that person in your life to not be there anymore is very difficult. And the reality is, I didn't get in touch as much as I could have done. I was always busy. And this is one thing I will say to anyone: call your dad, because you simply don't know when the day will come that they're not going to be there anymore, you know? So call your dad and make sure that he knows that you love him. Because I personally don't have that choice anymore, and it's just one of those things. You know, you have to get on with it. You have to be able to move past that, and you have to be able to understand that no one's coming to save you. The person that came to save me was no longer here anymore, and that's the reality. You know, and you have to understand as a male, you have to step up in that situation. You have to really take control of your life, because nobody is coming to save you. Nobody can save you anymore, especially when your dad passes away, because for me, that was the only person that I could really ring when times were tough and I needed something, I needed information, I needed to understand something a bit more, you know, and that's really shaped me as a man, because anyone that is having troubles with their dad, I almost automatically default try and fill that void and support, guide and help, because I understand what it's like when you don't have your dad, and, you know, you can't fill the void. It's impossible. You know, I can never be a coach and a mentor to a client who's lost their dad and go, yeah, I'm going to fill that void. It's impossible. So, you know, going through that process of grief, like, nobody wants to go through it, right? Nobody wants to go through grief. And unfortunately, it's just one of those things that everybody has to go through. But the one thing that you can really understand about yourself is what you want out of life. When you have such an important figure in your life that dies and that leaves you forever, you can't ring them, you can't pick their brains, you can't ask them for advice, you can't ask them for help. You really understand what you need to do for yourself. You know, as a man, you have to understand, okay, what do I really need to focus on? What do I need to step up on? You know, you need to essentially become the man that your dad was in many aspects of life. You know, you need to now then step into that shadow and step into those shoes where everybody who is around you, they ask you for help. They ask you, they come to you, because you don't have that reference point. There's nobody above you anymore. And unfortunately, I've had to do that at the age of fucking 26. You know, that's young. I'm young to be losing my dad, you know. But again, it's not really about me. Like, my mum has a hard time accepting it. You know, at the end of the day, he was a loved man. He was a very, very good man. And the only time I've really ever properly cried, and I'm talking like fucking bawling, was when I gave my speech at the funeral. And, you know, that's the last time I have ever cried, actually, because, you know, I don't really need to share those. I don't really ever have the ability to share those emotions, or need to be honest with you. But one thing I will say is the perspective shift that I had with not taking everything for granted, because I used to take everything for granted. And when my dad passed away, I really had a conversation with myself, and I was like, what do I want? You know, and I was living in the UK at the time, and that's really what kind of stemmed the Bali move. I was like, do you know what? I need to start living my life, and I need to start really capitalizing on what I want to do and the man I want to become. And I feel like that's not in the UK anymore. And the reason why I want to impact as many people, and I want to be a high impact coach and mentor, fundamentally isn't to get a new Lamborghini, isn't to get a new house, or isn't to buy anything. It's to secure my health. I don't ever want to be in a position where my dad was in, where he was relying on the National Health Service, because in my opinion, as good as the nurses were, the system as a whole failed him. And that's not something I'm ever going to get into. That's something that I know what happened. We know as a family what happened. And I'm not going to sit here berate the NHS, because ultimately it's not the individual nurses and the individual doctors' fault. It's a lack of funding, it's a lack of structure, it's a lack of the people who support and fund the NHS. They don't give a fuck, right? So I don't ever want to be in a position where I'm ever having to rely on a National Health Service. My wealth is going to be fully focused on prolonging my life, longevity. And anytime I have an issue, I have no problem whacking out the checkbook and say, right, how much is my health going to cost me? Don't care. And the great thing about Bali is that you can really pay a lot of money and get great healthcare service. You know, every time I've had even a remote issue, the service here in Bali has been absolutely second to none. And not a lot of people would think that. They go, right, fucking Bali is a third world country, blah, blah, blah. Trust me, you come here, you have an issue, you pay £300, £400, you'll get a lot for that £300, £400. You'll get everything sorted. You'll get your issue sorted. You know, I'm happy to pay that every now and again. You know, but then also it's not just a case of curing. Like, prevention is better than cure. It's about setting up yourself, and that's why I take TRT. That's why I don't expose myself to high levels of androgen anymore, because I don't want to put those toxins in my body. I don't want to damage my liver. I don't want to damage my kidney, then my heart. Like, you can't go to Tesco as the Sainsbury's and pick up a new liver or pick up a new kidney or pick up a new heart. You have one set of organs, so look after them like your life depends on them, because they fucking do. And that is all I have to say. You know, I don't wish this experience upon anybody. The reality is everyone has to go through this at some point. Everyone has to go through grief. Everyone has to lose a mum, lose a mother, lose a father, lose a grandma, lose a granddad, lose an uncle, lose a brother. Nobody wants it. You know, and there's nothing, having been through the situation myself, there's absolutely nothing that anyone can ever say to anyone to comfort them, you know, because the reality is nobody can be comforted in that situation. You just have to deal with the situation as best as you can. And everybody has their way of dealing with grief. Everybody has their way of coping with it. You know, my mindset is a pretty consistent one. However, there are days where I think about my dad and I think about what would he say, what would he do? And that's how I use it to fuel me and help me with my decision-making process. And it's a very healthy feedback loop and a very healthy relationship with my father now, because that's the relationship I have. The relationship I have with him is not in person, it's in my head. You know, it's, well, what would he say? What would dad do? What would he think? You know, rather than just picking up the phone. So, like I said earlier, if your dad's still around, pick up the phone right now and call him and tell him how much you love him, because there won't be many opportunities left. And that has been another episode of the Physique Podcast. Thank you very much.